At the funeral, the millionaire was already planning to divide the assets, until he heard the lawyer say the cleaner's name. At the funeral, the millionaire was already planning to divide the assets, until he heard the lawyer say the cleaner's name. You're about to discover an incredible story that will completely change how you see success, family, and what truly matters in life. If you're ready for a journey that will touch your heart and open your eyes, don't forget to like this video. Subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss stories like this one. Now let's dive into this amazing tale that begins on one of the rainiest days Manhattan had seen all year. Chapter 1. The Funeral That Changed Everything. The rain hammered against the stained glass windows of St. Patrick's Cathedral as if the sky itself was mourning. Inside, the pews were filled with New York's elite, business moguls, politicians, socialites, all dressed in their finest. Black attire. At the front of the cathedral lay an ornate mahogany casket, surrounded by elaborate flower arrangements that cost more than most people's monthly salary. Richard Blackstone, 52, sat in the front row adjusting his expensive Armani suit. His steel-grey eyes showed no trace of sadness as he glanced at his Rolex. The funeral was running 15 minutes over schedule, and he had important matters to attend to. Beside him sat his younger brother Marcus, 48, equally impatient, occasionally whispering calculations about stock portfolios and real estate values. Finally, Richard muttered under his breath as the priest concluded his eulogy about their father, Theodore Blackstone, the legendary real estate tycoon who had built an empire worth over $200 million. The brothers had been estranged from their father for nearly a decade. Theodore had disapproved of their ruthless business practices, their treatment of employees, and what he called their complete lack of humanity. But death, Richard thought cynically, had a way of bringing families together, especially when there was money involved. As the congregation began to file out for the procession to the cemetery, Richard's attention was drawn to a small, elderly Hispanic woman sitting alone in the very last pew. She wore a simple black dress that had clearly seen better years, and her weathered hands clutched a worn tissue. What struck him most was that she was the only person in the entire cathedral who appeared to be genuinely crying. "Who is that woman?" Marcus whispered, following his brother's gaze. Richard shrugged dismissively. "Probably some charity case Dad helped. You know how he got all sentimental in his final years." The woman was Carmen Vasquez, 67, who had worked as a cleaner in the Blackstone building for over 20 years. While the elite of Manhattan saw Theodore as a business legend, Carmen knew him as the kind man who always asked about her grandchildren, who made sure she had health insurance when she couldn't afford it, and who never failed to wish her a good morning despite his busy schedule. At Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, under a canopy that barely protected the mourners from the relentless downpour, the final part of the service took place. Richard checked his phone repeatedly, calculating how quickly he could get back to Manhattan for the will reading. His law firm had assured him that everything was in order. As the eldest son, he would inherit the lion's share of the estate, with Marcus receiving a substantial portion as well. Carmen stood at the back of the small crowd, gathered around the grave, her umbrella doing little to keep her dry. She whispered a prayer in Spanish, thinking about how Theodore had changed her life and the lives of so many others, whom the wealthy attendees would never even notice. After the casket was lowered into the ground, Richard approached the funeral director with barely concealed impatience. "When exactly is the will reading scheduled?" 4 o'clock sharp at Morrison, Klein & Associates, sir," the director replied professionally. "Your father was very specific about the timing." Richard smiled coldly. In less than 2 hours, he would finally gain control of the Blackstone empire. He had plans, big plans. The first order of business would be to eliminate all of his father's wasteful charitable programs and focus purely on profit maximization. As the crowd began to disperse, Richard noticed the Hispanic woman walking slowly toward an old dented Honda Civic. Something about her demeanor irritated him, the way she moved as if she had lost something precious, not just an employer. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice carrying the authority he was accustomed to wielding. Carmen turned, her eyes red from crying. "Yes, sir," she replied in accented English, clearly uncomfortable being addressed by someone so obviously wealthy and powerful. "Did you know my father well?" Richard asked, though his tone suggested he couldn't imagine how someone like her could have had any meaningful relationship with Theodore Blackstone. Carmen's face softened. Mr. Theodore, he was a good man, a very good man. He helped my family many times." Her voice broke slightly. "He will be missed by many people you probably never knew existed." Richard felt a flash of annoyance. "Well, I'm sure he was generous with his charity work, but business is business, you understand." Carmen studied his face for a moment, and something in her expression suggested she saw right through his cold exterior. "Your father, he always said that business without heart is just greed with paperwork." She paused, looking directly into his eyes. "I hope you remember that, sir." Before Richard could respond, Carmen walked away, leaving him standing in the rain with an uncomfortable feeling he couldn't quite identify. Marcus appeared at his side, equally wet and irritated. "Ready to go claim our inheritance, brother?" Marcus said with a grin that had no warmth in it. "More than ready," Richard replied, pushing aside the strange encounter with the cleaning woman. "It's time to turn this sentimental empire into a real business." As they walked toward their waiting limousine, neither brother noticed Carmen sitting in her old car, looking back at the cemetery one last time. She wasn't just mourning the loss of a kind employer, she was grieving for the man who had become like a father to her, and worried about what would happen to all the people Theodore had quietly helped over the years. The rain continued to fall as Manhattan's elite departed, eager to learn how Theodore Blackstone's fortune would be divided. None of them could have imagined that the most important name in the will belonged to the quiet woman they had barely noticed, the woman who had just driven away in a 20-year-old Honda, carrying with her secrets that would soon turn the Blackstone family's world completely upside down. The reading of the will was just 2 hours away, and everything the Blackstone brothers thought they knew about their father, their family, and their future was about to change forever. If you're as intrigued as we are to find out what Theodore Blackstone had planned, make sure you've hit that like button and subscribe to our channel, because what happens next will completely shock you. Chapter 2. The Will That No One Expected. The law offices of Morrison, Klein and Associates occupied the entire 42nd floor of a gleaming skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan. The conference room where the will reading would take place overlooked Central Park, its floor-to-ceiling windows normally offering a breathtaking view. Today, however, the storm clouds made the city look grey and ominous. Richard and Marcus arrived precisely at 3:55 p.m., both having changed into fresh suits and carrying themselves with the confidence of men about to inherit a fortune. They were accompanied by their wives, Richard's trophy wife, Vanessa, a former model who was more interested in the estate's art collection than her husband, and Marcus's wife, Jennifer, a socialite who had already begun planning how to redecorate their Hamptons estate with their anticipated windfall. "Gentlemen, ladies," greeted Harold Morrison, the senior partner who had been Theodore's attorney for over 30 years. Morrison was a distinguished man in his 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes that had seen every type of family drama money could create. "Please have a seat." The brothers chose seats at the head of the long mahogany table, with their wives flanking them. Richard drummed his fingers impatiently on the polished surface, while Marcus scrolled through his phone, already researching luxury yacht brokers. "Before we begin," Morrison said, settling into his chair with a thick folder in front of him, "I must tell you that your father spent considerable time crafting this will. He was very specific about his wishes, and I expect everyone to respect them, regardless of personal feelings." "Of course," Richard said smoothly. "Dad was always meticulous about business matters. We're prepared to honor his wishes and continue building the family legacy." Morrison's expression suggested he found Richard's words somehow amusing, though he kept his professional demeanor. "Very well. Let's begin with the reading of the last will and testament of Theodore Marcus Blackstone." As Morrison began reading the formal legal language, Richard allowed his mind to wander to his plans. He would sell off the smaller properties first, consolidate the portfolio, and then leverage everything to expand into new markets. His father's old-fashioned approach to business, treating employees well, maintaining affordable housing units, supporting local charities, would be the first things to go. "To my son Richard," Morrison continued, his voice cutting through Richard's daydreaming, "who has shown such dedication to the pursuit of wealth above all else, I leave the sum of $50,000 and my collection of business ethics books, which I hope he will finally read." The silence in the room was deafening. Richard's face went white, then red. "I'm sorry. What did you just say? Morrison repeated the bequest without emotion. Vanessa's perfectly manicured hand flew to her mouth in shock. That's impossible, Richard sputtered, standing up so quickly his chair rolled backward. There must be some mistake. I'm the eldest son, the heir apparent. To my son Marcus, Morrison continued, as if Richard hadn't spoken, who has always believed that money can solve any problem, I leave the sum of $50,000 and a year's subscription to a financial literacy course, hoping he might learn the difference between being wealthy and being rich. Marcus looked like he'd been slapped. Dad wouldn't do this to us. We're his sons. Morrison set down the document and looked at both brothers with something approaching pity. Your father was very clear about his reasoning. He felt that giving you his fortune would only enable behaviors that had already caused you to lose touch with your humanity. This is insane. Richard slammed his hand on the table. Who gets the rest of the estate then? Some random charity? The government? Actually, Morrison said, picking up the will again, your father was very specific about that as well. He cleared his throat and continued, reading. The remainder of my estate, including all real estate holdings, investment portfolios, business interests, and liquid assets, totaling approximately $187 million, I leave to Carmen Maria Vasquez. The name hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. Who the hell is Carmen Vasquez? Richard shouted, his usual composure completely shattered. Morrison reached for another folder. Mrs. Vasquez has worked as a cleaning professional in your father's building for over 20 years. According to your father's notes, she embodies all the qualities he valued most: kindness, integrity, hard work, and genuine care for others. Vanessa looked like she might faint. A cleaning lady? He left everything to a cleaning lady? There's more, Morrison continued. Your father has established the Vasquez Foundation, with Mrs. Vasquez as the sole trustee, dedicated to providing educational opportunities and support for working families. He believed she would use the money to help others in ways that would make him proud. Marcus had turned an alarming shade of purple. This is fraud. Dad wasn't in his right mind. We'll contest this will and tie it up in court for years. Morrison's expression hardened. Your father anticipated that reaction. He underwent extensive psychological evaluation just 6 months ago, and I have documentation proving his complete mental competency. Additionally, he recorded video messages explaining his reasoning, which will be released to the media if the will is contested. Richard sank back into his chair, the reality of the situation beginning to hit him. Video messages? Your father spent his final months documenting every act of kindness Mrs. Vasquez performed, every instance where she went above and beyond her duties to help others. He also documented other things. Morrison's pause was pregnant with meaning. Things about your business practices that might not look favorable in a public forum. The threat was clear, and both brothers understood it. Theodore had not only outwitted them, he had outmaneuvered them completely. Where is she? Richard asked quietly, his voice hollow. Where is this Carmen Vasquez? She's in the waiting room, Morrison replied. She was asked to come in today, though she has no idea why. Your father wanted the will read in her presence, but first gave you the opportunity to hear it privately. Richard looked at his brother, then at their wives, all of whom seemed to be in various stages of shock and denial. Everything they had counted on, everything they had planned for had just evaporated. Bring her in, Richard said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Morrison pressed a button on his desk intercom. Mrs. Chen, please ask Mrs. Vasquez to join us. A few moments later, the conference room door opened, and Carmen Vasquez walked in. She looked even smaller and more out of place in the opulent law office than she had at the cemetery. Her eyes were still red from crying, and she carried herself with the uncertain air of someone who didn't understand why she'd been summoned to such an important place. Mrs. Vasquez, Morrison said gently, please, have a seat. We have some very important information to share with you. Carmen sat down in the chair Morrison indicated, her eyes darting nervously between the hostile faces of the Blackstone family and the kind face of the attorney. Mrs. Vasquez, Morrison began, Theodore Blackstone has left you something in his will. Carmen's face crumpled slightly. Mr. Theodore was so kind to me. I don't need anything. He already gave me so much. The job, the insurance for my grandson's surgery. Richard's head snapped up. Insurance for surgery? Morrison nodded. Your father personally paid for Mrs. Vasquez's grandson's heart surgery 2 years ago. It cost over $150,000. Carmen looked confused by the attention. Is this about the pension? Mr. Theodore said he set up something small for my retirement. Morrison smiled gently. Mrs. Vasquez, Theodore Blackstone has left you his entire estate. You are now worth approximately $187 million. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of rain against the windows and Carmen's sharp intake of breath. She stared at Morrison as if he had just told her she could fly. I don't understand, she whispered. That's not possible. Richard watched this woman, this cleaning lady who had just inherited what should have been his empire, and felt something crack inside his chest. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was the terrible realization that his father had seen something in this simple woman that he had never seen in his own sons. And as Carmen began to cry, not from joy, but from the overwhelming weight of responsibility she felt toward Theodore's memory, Richard began to understand that his real inheritance wasn't money at all. It was the opportunity to finally learn what his father had been trying to teach him all along. Chapter 3. The Woman Who Changed Everything. Carmen sat in stunned silence for a full minute, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. The enormous sum of money meant nothing to her in that moment. All she could think about was the man who had shown her such unexpected kindness and the crushing responsibility she now felt to honor his memory. "This cannot be real," she whispered, her heavily accented English thick with emotion. "Mr. Theodore, he was kind to me, but this is too much. Too much for someone like me." Richard found himself studying this woman with new eyes. Her reaction was unlike anything he had ever witnessed. When he had received his first $1 million bonus, he had immediately started planning how to spend it. When Marcus had inherited money from their grandmother, he had bought a Ferrari the same day. But Carmen looked terrified by the fortune she had just inherited. "Mrs. Vasquez," Morrison said gently, "your former employer left you detailed instructions. He hoped you would use this money to continue the work he believed in, helping families like yours, providing opportunities for people who work hard but never catch a break." Carmen looked around the room, her eyes eventually settling on Richard's face. "You are his son. This money, it should be yours." The simple statement hit Richard like a physical blow. Here was a woman who had just inherited more money than she could spend in 10 lifetimes, and her first instinct was to give it away. To him, the person who had treated her with barely concealed contempt just hours earlier. Vanessa, who had been silent throughout the proceedings, suddenly spoke up. "Well, if you feel that way, perhaps we could arrange something." "Vanessa," Richard said sharply, surprising everyone in the room, including himself. He looked back at Carmen, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. "Mrs. Vasquez, tell me about my father. How did you know him?" Carmen wiped her eyes with the tissue she had been carrying since the funeral. "Every morning for 20 years, Mr. Theodore would come to work early. I would be cleaning the lobby, and he would always stop to talk. Not like a boss talking to a worker, like a friend." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "He asked about my children, my grandchildren. When my daughter lost her job, he helped her find work at one of his other buildings. When my grandson got sick," her voice broke, "the doctors said we needed surgery, but our insurance, it wouldn't cover everything. We were going to lose our house." Richard felt something uncomfortable stirring in his chest. What did he do? He paid for everything. The surgery, the hospital stay, even the follow-up care. "But he made me promise never to tell anyone." Carmen looked directly at Richard. "He said his family wouldn't understand his choices." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "Dad never told us about any of this. He told me he had 2 sons," Carmen continued. "He was proud of how smart you both were, how successful. But he was sad too. He said you had forgotten how to see people, really see them." Morrison opened another folder. "Mrs. Vasquez, your employer also left you these." He handed her a stack of letters, each one addressed to her in Theodore's distinctive handwriting. With trembling hands, Carmen opened the first letter and began to read aloud in her halting English. "My dear Carmen, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have just learned about the gift I have left you. I know you are frightened and confused, but I need you to understand something important." Her voice caught, and Richard found himself leaning forward, desperate to hear what his father had written. I have watched you for 20 years, and I have never seen you act with anything but kindness and integrity. When you found that wallet in the elevator and tracked down its owner, when you stayed late to help that young mother with her sick baby, when you gave your own lunch to the homeless man outside our building, these are the moments that convinced me you would know what to do with this responsibility. Carmen stopped reading, overcome with emotion. Morrison gently took the letter from her and continued. My sons have great intelligence and ambition, but they have never learned that true wealth comes from lifting others up. I hope that by giving you this gift, I can teach them what I failed to teach them myself, that money is only valuable when it serves love. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Carmen's quiet crying and the rain still beating against the windows. Richard stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the grey city below. For the first time in years, he was thinking about something other than profit margins and market share. He was remembering a conversation he'd had with his father 15 years ago after Richard had fired an entire department to boost quarterly earnings. You're becoming someone I don't recognize, Theodore had said. When did you decide that people were just numbers on a spreadsheet? Richard had laughed it off then, calling his father soft and out of touch with modern business. Now, watching Carmen struggle with the weight of unexpected responsibility, he began to understand what his father had been trying to tell him. Mrs. Vasquez, Richard said, turning back to face her, what will you do with the money? Carmen looked up at him with eyes that held wisdom earned through decades of hard work and small acts of kindness. I don't know how to be rich, she said simply, but I know how to help people. Mr. Theodore, he taught me that having enough is a blessing, but having too much is a responsibility. She stood up, still clutching the letters. Maybe you could help me. You know about business, about money. I know about people who need help. Maybe together we could do what Mr. Theodore wanted. Richard stared at this woman who was offering to share an inheritance that rightfully should have been his, not out of obligation or guilt, but from genuine desire to honor his father's wishes. For the first time since he was a child, Richard felt ashamed of who he had become. Why would you want my help? He asked quietly. I've been nothing but rude to you. Carmen smiled sadly. Because you are his son, and because I think, deep down, you have the same heart he did. It's just been sleeping for a very long time. Marcus, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. This is insane. We're talking about giving away a fortune to strangers. Not giving away, Carmen corrected gently. Investing. Mr. Theodore always said the best investment was in people who had been waiting for their chance. Richard looked at his brother, then at his wife, then back at Carmen. He thought about the empire he had planned to build, the ruthless efficiency he had wanted to implement, the people he would have displaced in pursuit of higher profits. Then he thought about his father, lying in his grave just a few miles away, and the 20 years of morning conversations with a cleaning lady who had apparently understood Theodore Blackstone better than his own sons ever had. Mrs. Vasquez, Richard said, his voice hoarse with emotion he hadn't felt in years, I think my father would be very pleased with your idea. Outside, the storm was beginning to break, and the first rays of sunlight in hours began to filter through the clouds over Manhattan. Inside the conference room, something equally dramatic was happening. The beginning of a transformation that would change not just the Blackstone family, but the lives of countless people they had never even met. The cleaning lady who had inherited a fortune was about to teach a millionaire's son the most valuable lesson of his life, that true wealth isn't about what you can accumulate, but about what you can give away. Chapter 4. The Legacy That Really Mattered. 6 months later, the Blackstone Foundation occupied 3 floors of the building, where Carmen had once cleaned offices at dawn. The transformation had been remarkable, not just of the space, but of the people working within it. Richard stood in the Foundation's main conference room, looking out at a view that was familiar yet completely different. The morning sun streamed through windows that Carmen insisted be kept spotless. A clean window lets in more light, she often said, and Richard had come to understand. She wasn't just talking about glass. The quarterly report, Mr. Richard, said Maria Santos, a young woman who had been the Foundation's first scholarship recipient and was now its program coordinator. 6 months ago, Maria had been working 3 jobs to support her family while trying to finish her education degree. Today, she was implementing programs that would help hundreds of other young people in similar situations. Richard still sometimes marveled at how naturally Carmen had taken to running a foundation. Her instincts about people were flawless. She could spot genuine need from across a room and identify potential in places where others saw only problems. What had taken Richard decades to learn about business, Carmen seemed to understand intuitively about human nature. "How many families are we helping now?" Richard asked, reviewing the report. 437 directly, Maria replied. "But if you count the secondary impact, the children who can stay in school because their parents have stable work, the small businesses we've helped start, we're probably touching over 1,000 lives." The door opened, and Carmen entered with her usual quiet energy. At 67, she moved with purpose and carried herself with a confidence that had grown remarkably over the past months. Behind her walked Dr. Samuel Chen, a cardiologist from Mount Sinai Hospital. "Samuel," Richard stood to greet the doctor. "How did the surgery go?" Dr. Chen smiled broadly. "Little. Miguel is going to be fine. The operation was a complete success. He'll be running around the playground in 6 weeks." Carmen's face lit up with joy. Miguel was the 7-year-old grandson of one of her former co-workers at the cleaning company. When they learned he needed the same type of heart surgery Carmen's own grandson had required, there was never any question about what the foundation would do. "That's wonderful news," Richard said, and meant it completely. 6 months ago, he would have seen Miguel as a line item in a budget. Now he saw him as Carmen did, as a little boy who deserved the chance to grow up healthy and strong. Marcus appeared in the doorway, looking somewhat awkward, as he always did during his visits to the foundation. The relationship between the brothers had been strained since the will reading, but lately, Marcus had been making efforts to understand what Richard was doing. "The Times reporter is here," Marcus announced. "She wants to interview you about the foundation's impact." Richard grimaced. The media attention had been unavoidable once word got out about the will and the subsequent creation of the foundation. Most articles focused on the unusual inheritance and the heartwarming story of the cleaning lady who became a philanthropist. But Richard knew that wasn't really the story at all. The real story was about a father who had found a way to teach his son about love and responsibility even after death. It was about a woman who understood that wealth was a tool, not a destination. And it was about the slow, sometimes painful process of becoming the person you were meant to be all along. "I'll speak to her," Richard said, "but I want Carmen to be part of the interview too." Carmen shook her head. "You know I don't like all that attention. This is your family's story to tell." "No," Richard said firmly. "This is our story. All of us." 20 minutes later, Richard sat across from Jennifer Walsh, an investigative reporter from the New York Times who had been following the foundation's work. Carmen sat beside him, still uncomfortable with the spotlight, but understanding its importance for their mission. "Mr. Blackstone," Walsh began, "6 months ago, you inherited $50,000 while your father's cleaning lady inherited nearly $200 million. Most people would be bitter. Instead, you're working together to give that money away. How do you explain that?" Richard considered the question carefully. "My father spent his life trying to teach me something I was too arrogant to learn. It took losing an inheritance to finally understand what he was offering me instead." "Which was?" "The chance to matter," Richard said simply. "For 40 years, I thought success meant accumulating more than the next person. Carmen taught me that success means being the reason someone else can succeed." Walsh turned to Carmen. "Mrs. Vasquez, do you ever regret inheriting this money? Your life was certainly simpler before." Carmen thought for a moment before answering. "My life was simpler, yes, but it wasn't smaller. Mr. Theodore, he didn't give me money. He gave me the chance to help people the way he helped me. How could I regret that?" "What would you want Theodore Blackstone's legacy to be?" Walsh asked. Richard looked at Carmen and she nodded for him to answer. "I want people to understand that my father didn't leave his money to Carmen because she deserved it more than his sons did," Richard said. "He left it to her because she already understood what took me months to learn, that we're not here to see how much we can get, but to see how much we can give." After the interview, Richard and Carmen stood together in the foundation's main lobby, watching the controlled chaos of people coming and going. Scholarship recipients meeting with mentors, small business owners receiving microloans, families getting help with medical bills or housing deposits. "Sometimes I think about that day at the cemetery," Richard said, When you told me business without heart was just greed with paperwork, Carmen smiled. I was scared to say that to you. You looked so angry and important. I was angry, Richard admitted, but not at you. I was angry because somehow you knew my father better than I did. You know him now, Carmen said gently. Every time you help someone, every time you choose kindness over profit, you know him. Richard's phone buzzed with a text from his assistant. Vanessa's, lawyer called. Divorce papers are ready for your signature. The divorce had been inevitable. Vanessa couldn't understand Richard's transformation, couldn't accept that he was more interested in changing lives than increasing net worth. She had found someone else, another wealthy man who shared her values and priorities. Surprisingly, Richard felt only relief. For the first time in years, he was becoming someone he actually liked. Mr. Richard, Carmen said, noticing his thoughtful expression, your father, he would be very proud of who you're becoming. Richard looked around the bustling lobby, at the pictures on the walls showing families who had been helped, at the quote painted above the reception desk in Theodore's handwriting. Wealth is not about what you can afford to buy, but about what you can afford to give away. I hope so, Richard said. I finally hope so. 6 months earlier, Richard Blackstone had stood in a cemetery planning to inherit a fortune. Today, he understood that he had inherited something much more valuable, the knowledge that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in the lives you touch and the love you leave behind. Carmen Vasquez had taught a millionaire's son that the most important inheritance isn't money. It's the wisdom to use whatever you have in service of others. And in a world that too often confuses having everything with being everything, that lesson was worth more than all the riches Theodore Blackstone could have left behind. As the sun set over Manhattan, casting golden light through the spotless windows of the foundation, Richard finally understood what his father had been trying to tell him all along. The greatest fortune you can leave your children isn't money in the bank, but the knowledge of how to fill someone else's empty hands. The story of Theodore Blackstone, Carmen Vasquez, and Richard's transformation reminds us that the most valuable inheritances aren't the ones written in wills, they're the lessons, written in our hearts. Sometimes it takes losing everything we thought we wanted to discover, everything we actually needed. If this story touched you the way it touched us, please like this video to help us share these important messages with others. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories that remind us what really matters in life. And don't forget to hit that notification bell so you never miss content that could change the way you see the world. What inheritance do you want to leave behind? Let us know in the comments below, and remember, true wealth isn't about what you can afford to buy, but about what you can afford to give away.